All right. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marlon Wilson, and we have another fantastic debate for you today. A good old classical evidentialist versus precept apologetics debate, and this is about to be a fantastic one. I have David Pallmann, and I have Matthew Wiersema. I hope I pronounced his name right. I'll be jacking Matthew's last name up, but he'll correct me once he gets in. But I do thank you for joining me. Before we jump into this, I do want to go ahead and encourage you to like and follow The Gospel Truth. Make sure you hit that subscribe and that notification bell so you can stay in loop with the Gospel Truth that's going on. If you don't know, all this content is not only on YouTube, but also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So make sure you're flowing over there and supporting the ministry with a follow or subscribe over on those platforms as well. Also, for your audio pleasure, we also have all these debates, all these interviews on podcasts. So make sure you're flowing to the podcast, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. Make sure you're jumping on there. And once again, supporting the ministry with a subscribe, and make sure you leave a good rating as well on those podcasts. All right, make sure you do that. As always, I do have a whole bunch of shows coming up here in the future that I want you to be aware of. All right, coming up very soon, the much anticipated God Possesses Dynamic Omniscience debate, Anthony Rogers versus Warren McGrew. So make sure you are checking this one out, because this is going to be a big debate, and I'm excited to have both of these guys on, because I know these guys are going to bring the heat. After that, I do have another highly anticipated debate. If you haven't watched Leighton Flowers lately, he's been trying to go in as much as he can on Pastor Gabriel Hughes. So these guys are going to go at it, man. I know these guys are going to bring it. What is the expository understanding of John chapter 6, verse 44? So I am looking forward to this debate. After that, I have, are Unitarians considered Christians? I have Kelly Powell versus Andrew Griffin. Kelly has been on before. Andrew's been on about 3 times. Kelly's been on about 1 time. He's going to give it another go around. So make sure you be on the lookout for this debate. It's going to be a great one. All right. And then lastly, I have a 2-on-2 debate. These are always fun debates. This is going to be a big debate as well. I have Francis Turretin, Dan Chapa, William Aldrich, and Sam Shimon. So we are going to get into it. Perpetual virginity debate. Was Mary ever virgin? So I know this is going to be a hot debate. So make sure you are tuning in to The Gospel Truth. Make sure once again you're hitting that subscribe button and our notification bell so you don't miss out on any of these debates. That said, I do have my guest here once again, David Pallmann and Matthew Wiersema, and these guys have been on before, as always, but I had these guys on before. David's been on, Matthew's been on, so these guys know the rules. They know how to get down on The Gospel Truth, man, and they're about to jump to this octagon to debate some classical versus precept. Y'all ready for that, man? I know many of you guys have been looking forward to this debate. Yesterday, I couldn't get on, man. My son came down with a little fever, so, daddy had to step in and do some daddy stuff, man. But I thank you guys for sticking with me. And as promised, this debate is about to go down. Let me bring these guys in so they can further introduce themselves. What's up, fellas? How y'all doing?
Good. How are you, Marlon?
Doing well.
Doing well. Glad to have you guys back for another exciting episode of Gospel Truth. You guys are about to be debating a good old precept classical debate, man. And this is a high topic. This is almost Calvinism versus Arminianism type of feel to it, man. Oh, my bad. I do got a Calvinist and Arminian in the house. My bad, So we do got a little bit of that feel. But this is going to be an excellent, fun debate. And I think you guys are going to perform very well. You guys are going to be able to express your positions very well. And I'm excited. And the audience is excited as well. But before we jump into this debate, I'm going to allow you guys to introduce yourself. Tell them what you do, YouTube, podcasts, blogs, whatever you do. Tell them what you do. Start with David, if you don't mind. Give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I am a member of the Society of Evangelical Arminians, and I periodically write articles in defense of Arminianism. You can find those on Cerebral Faith and Free Thinking Ministries. I have a YouTube channel called Faith Because of Reason. You can check out my work there, mostly apologetics and theology. And then soon I'll be starting a new podcast called Christian Evidentialism, where me and my co-host will be matters of theology, faith, apologetics from an evidentialist perspective.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, Matt, go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself, man.
I'm Matthew Wiersema. I'm a street preacher and apologist, and I've been doing anti-abortion activism over the past several years. I have a YouTube channel named Matthew Wiersema, which is a place where another outlet where I reach the public and educate people about the gospel and apologetics. So thanks for having me on.
No problem. Thank you guys once again for joining me on this episode, man. Once again, this is an exciting debate, so let's not wait anymore. Let's get into it, all right? So we're going to start this. Once again, the topic is innate knowledge of God. Innate knowledge of God is a necessity for all knowledge, all right? So we're going to start that out with 10-minute opening statements. That's going to be followed by 5-minute rebuttals. Then we're going to have a 40-minute open discussion between you two. The only time I'll jump in there is if I hear any ad hominems or rude talking and you guys cutting each other off too much. And that's going to be followed up by a 5-minute closing, just some Q&A from the audience. Sounds good?
Yep.
All right. That said, Matthew, you are arguing in affirming this debate. Let me know when you're ready and when you begin to speak. Oh, don't forget the chime. That chime is once again your 1-minute warning to begin to conclude your presentation. So when you begin to speak, I'll start your time.
Okay. Everyone operates on faith, and everyone appeals to an ultimate authority for truth. When doing apologetics, one must make very clear to the unbeliever that he is operating according to a certain view of the world or worldview and has a web of connected beliefs. Ask the unbeliever what their religion is and learn about their belief system so that you can properly engage with it. Faith can be defined as mentally assenting to something being true. It is basically synonymous with belief. People mentally assent to various propositions being true, propositions that compose their worldview, and thus use faith, in other words, believe certain things about reality. Make this very clear to the lost person who says, I don't believe in God, I don't operate on faith, I know about reality through science. Ask such a person if they have confidence in science or in their cognitive abilities and senses. They will likely reply that they do. Then tell them that the Latin root of confidence is con fide, which means with faith. You can thus show the unbeliever how he or she does put faith in certain propositions about reality, and if the person says, I'm not religious, tell that person that a religion is basically just a belief system that one uses to make sense of reality, and that since they have their own set of beliefs and that they use to make sense of the world, they actually are religious. The important question at this point is, does one's religion actually make sense of reality and provide a solid epistemological foundation for understanding truth? Now that we have seen how important the concept of faith is, it's time to show how it is vital to knowledge itself. As I stated before, faith can be a synonym for belief. When you believe something, you put your faith in it. A good definition for knowledge is justified true belief. In order to know something, you have to believe it to be true. You need to be justified in believing it to be true. And the thing you are justified in believing actually has to be true. So since faith is synonymous with belief, this means that knowledge requires faith. Make this clear to the unbeliever who says, I don't use faith to know things. I use science or my senses, or it can be demonstrated through repeated testing. Show them how faith or belief is an essential part of knowing. One can see how the person who says, I don't use faith to know things, is stating a self-contradicting sentence when one replaces the word faith with the word belief and the word know with justified true belief. What you end up with is the self-contradicting statement, I don't use belief to have justified true belief. When discussing epistemology, it is essential to talk about what beliefs about reality that each person is putting faith in. These foundational beliefs about reality can be called presuppositions. Communicate to the unbeliever that everyone has a worldview with its own presuppositions about reality that are used to make sense of the world. Also make very clear that each worldview has its own highest authority that is looked to for the truth about reality. The key to effectively destroying the unbeliever's arguments is to show them the foolishness of what the presuppositions of their worldview lead to, and that they are in fact embracing such foolishness because they are suppressing the truth about God that they already know, as we are told in Romans chapter 1. The unbeliever is in the position of having the work of the law written on their heart, as Romans 2 tells us, and thus have innate knowledge that there is a lawgiver. They are justified in believing certain things to be true about reality, like the uniformity of nature, the reliability of their senses and cognitive abilities, and that other minds exist outside of them, because deep down they actually believe that God created them and everything else. They can have knowledge or justified true belief because of the innate knowledge of himself that God has given every single person. The unbeliever is thus holding two opposing and contradictory beliefs, an innate and perhaps more subconscious suppressed belief in God, and at the same time putting faith in or mentally assenting to a belief system that is in opposition to God as the highest authority, because it is created by men who in their rebellion against God and desire for autonomy set themselves and their own ideas up as their own final authority. Our job is to pave the way for the message of reconciliation by tearing down the walls of that the unbeliever has built up to protect their suppression of this truth about God and their self-worship, namely the arguments that promote false beliefs in their worldview. We can do this by showing the fundamental difference between the Christian worldview and all other non-Christian worldviews, and how the latter is bankrupt when it comes to providing a foundation for justified true beliefs, or in other words, knowledge. Most, if not all, worldviews make use of faith in some kind of revelation. For naturalistic atheists, the revelation is from one's senses to one's mind. They put faith in the concept of physical senses giving an immaterial mind correct information about the world. In this worldview, otherwise known as secular humanism, man is blatantly held up as the highest authority, since faith in his senses and cognitive reasoning is what is used to try to justify beliefs. The problem with this is that the human mind is not omniscient and does not know everything, which is easily seen by experience in which the human mind learns new things every day. Because the human mind is not omniscient, if it is trusted as the only source of true information about reality, the one who trusts in it must recognize that there could be something about reality that one's mind does not know about that could make false everything that one's mind believes to be true. This must be shown to the unbeliever to make him realize that if the limited, finite human mind is the ultimate authority to be looked to for truth, then truth cannot be obtained, and being justified in believing anything to be true is impossible, and thus knowledge is impossible. The unbelieving worldview that relies on faith in limited consciousness for truth cannot justify one's beliefs, and so it must be abandoned for the Christian worldview, the one in which God is the ultimate authority, the one who knows everything, who never lies, and who reveals to limited human minds what the true nature of reality is through the innate knowledge he creates them with, through general revelation, the things that have been made, and through special revelation, the Bible. Humans can be justified in believing in the uniformity of nature, the existence of other entities and minds, the difference between material and immaterial, and the reliability of human senses, because the all-knowing being Yahweh reveals to our non-all-knowing minds that these things exist. Communicate to the unbeliever that this is actually the proof of the Christian worldview, the fact that if there is no revelation from the one who knows all the facts about reality, proving anything to be true is impossible, because self-revelation in limited human minds that could always be wrong could never justify any beliefs about reality, and thus could never have knowledge or proof of anything. This is why the proof for the truth of the Christian worldview is that without the Christian worldview, proof is impossible. The next unbeliever who asks you to prove that God exists needs to hear this, but he also needs to hear that he doesn't need you to prove it to him because he already knows that it's true. One might ask, well, there are other religions that put faith in revelation from omniscient being, like Islam. To address this, it is good to show the unbeliever how the worldview example that he or she might bring up as an example actually contradicts and refutes itself. This is what is called an internal critique of religion. Since a religion that contradicts itself cannot be trusted to justify beliefs about reality and thus furnish knowledge, it should be abandoned. Let the unbeliever know that since every non-Christian worldview involves suppression of the one true worldview, they will tend to end up engaging in contradictions and self-refutations. Tell them that every religion that is not Christianity results in the adherent contradicting themselves, since the adherent would be mentally assenting to that religion while deep down knowing that Yahweh exists. They will ask you how you know that all non-Christian religions are false in suppression of the truth. Tell them that that is what your ultimate authority, God, indicates in his infallible revelation in the Bible. And if he does not exist and does not reveal the true nature of reality to you, then you can't be justified in believing anything to be true, including the belief that actual other religions even exist. This is why all non-Christian religions are actually appealing to and putting faith in man's limited consciousness for truth and not omniscience, since any omniscient being that happens to be a part of their worldview is the construct of the human mind in its effort to suppress the truth that already knows about the one true God, Yahweh. Never give up allegiance to your ultimate authority. Neutrality is impossible. Once one starts looking at the evidence for the truth of other religions to see if they might be true, one is at that point making oneself and one's own mind one's own highest authority, and is thus rejecting what God says in favor of faith in one's own mind, which can't be trusted if God did not create it to perceive true things about the world. Once a person denies the truth of God's word in their journey to assess the facts to see if God's word is true and other religions are actually false, to be consistent, at that point the person has to admit that they can't be justified in believing anything to be true because they have abandoned faith in omniscient consciousness in exchange for faith in limited consciousness, which could always be wrong if there is no revelation from the all-knowing consciousness of God to tell them that it's not wrong. So that's my presentation on why presuppositional apologetics should be used to advance the Christian faith and show unbelievers that they're actually suppressing the truth about God that they already know.
All right. Thank you so much, Matthew, for that opening statement. All right, David, you are up. I will restart your time. I will start your time once you begin to speak.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for hosting this debate, Marlon, and thanks for participating, Matthew. I appreciate the courage that you have in, going out into the world and confronting people on these sorts of issues. But of course, I do vehemently disagree with the approach that you take. So the question before us is innate knowledge of God necessary for all other knowledge? And this question regards both the place of theistic belief within our theory of knowledge, whether it is inferential or non-inferential, as well as the nature of that knowledge, whether it is acquired or innate. Now, it's my position that knowledge of God, while attainable, is neither non-inferential nor innate. But even if I accepted that knowledge of God was both, Matthew still has a very long road ahead of him because he has to establish not just that knowledge of God is non-inferential and innate, but also that it's a prerequisite for knowing anything else. And I would say that's an uphill battle for him. So in this debate, I'll endeavor to show that knowledge of a great many things is achievable wholly apart from knowledge of God. If knowledge of even one thing is possible apart from knowledge of God, then Matthew's position will be shown to be false. Now, it'll probably be helpful to begin by giving an analysis of what knowledge is. If we can establish a working definition, then it simply becomes a question of whether anything fits this definition without dependence upon theism. A common definition for knowledge is justified true belief. The sorts of beliefs which I'm concerned with in this debate are propositional beliefs, that is, beliefs which have a propositional content, and consequently they have the capacity to be truth bearers. I'm working under the assumption that truth refers to a property of beliefs which correspond to facts and reality. Finally, I'm concerned with justification in the internalist sense, that is, being aware of a reason which guarantees or makes likely the truth of a belief which it justifies. If my opponent contests any aspect of this definition, then we can discuss that later, but for now, that's what I mean when I'm talking about knowledge. So now that we have a working definition of knowledge, we can reframe the debate question as follows. Is an innate justified true belief in God's existence necessary for all other knowledge? Now, what exactly is innate knowledge? If something is innate to us, this means that it is built into us or present in us from birth. Now, I should probably begin by saying that I'm a skeptic of the very possibility of this kind of knowledge. It's not evident to me that human beings are born believing anything. And since belief is a necessary component of knowledge, as Matthew himself noted, if humans aren't born believing propositions, then they aren't born with knowledge. And even if humans are born believing certain propositions, it's less clear how those beliefs can be justified. And since justification is a requirement for knowledge, without an account of how innate beliefs can be justified, we have a strong reason for rejecting the possibility of innate knowledge. But let's say that Matthew is able to give us an account of how an innate belief can be justified. Let's say that I grant him that theism can even be an innate belief which is justified. That still doesn't get him to the conclusion that it is for knowledge of anything else. Yet I think I can go further than this. I believe that I can definitively show that knowledge of other things is possible apart from God, which entails that the thesis which he is defending is false. So the theory of epistemic justification, which I endorse, is a form of infallibilist foundationalism, where basic or foundational beliefs are justified by reference to direct acquaintance. Now, a direct acquaintance is a relationship which obtains between consciousness and some thought, fact, or property. An example of this would be like a headache. When I'm in pain, I have an unmediated access to that fact. There are no fallible steps by which I undertake to determine this. It is a direct connection between my consciousness and that fact. On the theory which I'm interested in defending, one has infallible justification for believing a proposition when they have three distinct acquaintances. First, direct acquaintance with their belief. As already noted, beliefs are. Second, direct acquaintance with a fact. Facts are truth makers, and then because we also want some justification for that, we also posit direct acquaintance with the relation of correspondence between the fact and the belief, and that the fact makes the belief true. And so when you have all three of these acquaintances, then literally everything which makes a belief true is immediately before. There's nothing that one could possibly want to justify that. Hence, when these three acquaintances are fulfilled, one has a justified belief, the truth of which is guaranteed. In other words, one has knowledge. This applies to any sort of experiential knowledge as well as abstract knowledge, such as logical knowledge, where one has the relevant acquaintances with abstract concepts. Moreover, one does not need to have any prior knowledge of God For on this model, one is appealing to acquaintances for non-inferential justification. No appeal to a further belief, let alone a theistic belief, is needed. Therefore, if this model of justification is viable, as I think it is, then we have a straightforward reason to reject the idea that knowledge of God, innate or otherwise, is needed for knowledge of anything else. Before concluding, let me address Matthew's most common objection to this sort of account. In his videos where he discusses epistemology with atheists and skeptics, Matthew likes to ask how they know that they exist. And when appeals are made to the sort of experiential stage which I have subsumed within acquaintance, Matthew responds by asking how they know that each aspect of this experience corresponds to a singular I or me, as opposed to a plural we or us. As best as I can interpret him, Matthew seems to think that it is theoretically possible that different elements within a given visual field can be experienced by different conscious entities, which are then combined into a singular visual field. And unless this possibility is eliminated, so the argument goes, one can't be sure that they are a single entity rather than a multiplicity of entities. I have 4 responses to that argument. First, we can ask where these different aspects of experience come together. If multiple entities are having distinct experiences, then how is it that they are experienced as a whole? Even if each aspect of experience is given to a distinct entity, we may simply refer to I or myself as the entity which experiences the whole. Second, Matthew's account requires that multiple entities have direct experiences, which are then collected together somewhere, such that the whole is an indirect and derivative experience. But I know that this is false because I am directly acquainted with the unity of my experience. My access to this content is direct, and therefore my account, which says that an account which says that it is indirect, is necessarily false. Third, I should prefer the hypothesis that I am a singular unit of consciousness on the grounds of simplicity. All things being equal, simpler hypotheses, which posit the existence of fewer entities, are more likely to be true. Hence, in the absence of specific evidence for a multiplicity of entities, I am justified in believing that I am a singular entity. Fourth, we may point out that Matthew has the same problem. How can he know that he is a singular entity rather than multiple entities? He can't appeal to the Bible, for although the Bible might rule that out as being the case in general, it doesn't rule it out for him because the Bible says nothing about Matthew's in particular, nothing about his ontology. So to briefly recap, I have defined knowledge as justified true belief. I have expressed skepticism about the very possibility of innate knowledge. I have pointed out that even if innate knowledge of God exists, the acquaintance model of epistemic justification ensures that knowledge of a great many things is attainable without prior knowledge of God. And if we can agree on the definition of knowledge, then Matthew has a twofold challenge. First, he needs to develop an account of innate knowledge, which in fact satisfies the conditions for knowledge. And then second, he needs to show us why innate knowledge of God is a prerequisite for other types of knowledge. At a minimum, this will require him to show why the acquaintance theory, which I laid out, doesn't secure knowledge apart from God. Finally, I've offered 4 rebuttals to Matthew's most common objections to my theory of knowledge. I look forward to seeing how he replies to them. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you both for those opening statements. Now we're jumping into the rebuttal round. Matthew, you're up. Let me know when you start speaking. I'll start your time.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to. So when it comes to innate knowledge, innate comes from the Bible. In Romans chapter 2, where it says that God wrote the work of the law, indicates that God wrote the work of the law on everyone's heart. So there's innate knowledge right there. People know that there's a law. It was built into them that justified true belief that there is a law, and we can conclude from that there is an awareness of a lawgiver, that there's an underlying subconscious understanding that there's a uniformity in nature and that they were created by God for a purpose, that they can perceive reality correctly, and they're accountable to God. So they have these underlying beliefs that God gives them. And I believe this because I don't see any other way that beliefs could be justified. Because, for example, I don't even know how you could justify the belief that beliefs exist if it is possible, because it is possible without revelation from God that the only type of consciousness that exists is a consciousness that exists for a nanosecond or a tiny infinitesimal amount of time. And perhaps, I mean, if we don't know what God says about reality, how do we know that reality isn't a giant? How do we know that any conscious experience isn't just a long string of nanoseconds of different consciousnesses that come into existence and then die in rapid succession? And so how can we apply the singular pronoun I to a stream of consciousness that's actually not one consciousness, that doesn't belong to one entity? It's actually billions of different entities coming into existence and ceasing to exist. And so, like, if a belief is a mental sensation that takes time to happen, how can you even be justified in saying that beliefs exist if that belief is just composed of different mental sensations that exist in tiny consciousnesses that have very short time spans that can't even last long enough to hold a belief? If a belief, because a belief happens in time, you can always break that belief down into tiny segments and be like, well, maybe there's a consciousness that exists at this tiny amount of time that makes it so that there's no longer a way to fit belief inside that consciousness. But you can't refer to all those different consciousnesses as I. You'd have to say we, but is it I or is it we? There's no way to tell. There's no way to know. There's no way to be justified in believing that you can use the singular pronoun I to refer to consciousness, and you can't even be justified in believing in the concept of belief because of that possibility without revelation from God. But God reveals to us that humans exist in the Bible and that they have a stream of consciousness, that they continue to exist through time, and their consciousness is not tiny, and it doesn't exist for a nanosecond. It exists for years. And so the Bible indicates that to us. That's revelation from God. If we don't have that information from the all-knowing being to tell us the true nature of reality, then we're stuck with our limited consciousness that doesn't know everything and therefore could always be wrong about what we think is true. And so that's why I believe in innate knowledge from God, because I don't see any other possible way to justify one's belief, to justify one's beliefs. So, yep, that's my response.
All right, cool. Thank you so much. All right, David, you're back up on the stage for your 5-minute rebuttal. And I will start the time once you begin to speak.
All right. Well, I got a lot to cover here, so I'll see if I can get it all. I'm glad we were able to agree on the justified true belief definition of knowledge, as that has recently become controversial. So there is a point of commonality there. This point about that everyone appeals to an authority, I want to disagree with that. So, I mean, yes, there are authorities in the sense that, like, I'll presume we're talking about epistemic authorities, right? Authorities that can tell us what to believe. Sure, yeah, those exist, right? There are experts and scholars, and I'm even happy to say that God, counts as an epistemic authority, even the highest epistemic authority, if you want to say. But for me, justification doesn't bottom out in authorities, right? Everything goes back to acquaintances and inferences, and that's the foundations of knowledge right there. In order to justifiably believe that an authority is worth believing, then I've got to have reasons for that, right? So everything doesn't go back to an authority in my model, and I think it's just false that everything has to. Let's see. As far as having a law written on your heart, Matthew made the inference from that to that, therefore you have knowledge of the lawgiver, and that's just quite simply false. I mean, if I come across a book that has writing in it, then I have knowledge of that, but I don't have knowledge of who the author is necessarily, right? Unless the writing is about the author, right? But presumably the moral law that's written on our heart, this is about moral truths. It's not about God. So just by saying that the Bible says that we have the law of God written on our heart, sure, but it doesn't follow from that therefore we have the proposition God exists written on our heart, let alone that we believe that, right? Because we should also point out that it doesn't follow that you have beliefs about the law just from the fact that it's written on your heart, right? You could fail to form a corresponding belief about that. So it just does not follow from the fact that the law of God is written on our hearts that therefore we have innate knowledge. And I would also like to hear an account of how that knowledge, even if it exists, could be justified. Now, a big part of Matthew's case depends on this idea that because our consciousness is limited, therefore we can be wrong about anything, because we could always discover something that we think, something that could overturn everything that we think that we know. And I just say he's given us no good reason to accept that. Why should anyone accept the proposition that just because we aren't omniscient, therefore we can be wrong about everything that we know? If the acquaintance model that I have proposed works, this secures knowledge in an autonomous way. That is, you can know something in and of itself without knowing anything else. And so if that model works, and we haven't heard any objections to it yet, then it's just false that the mere fact that you don't know everything means that something could overturn everything that you think that you know. That is simply we have incorrigible knowledge of the beliefs which fulfill the three acquaintances which I set forth in my opening, and nothing can defeat those. They are incorrigible, they're infallible, they are not subject to defeat, and so it is quite simply false that something could come along and defeat that. So he says that if we assume the Christian worldview, then we can justify the belief that our sensory perception is reliable, or that there's uniformity in nature, that nature is going to behave regularly. And I'd like to say how. I mean, he didn't give us any account of how that can be justified. He simply said, oh, if we assume it, then it's justified. Well, we have not heard any way that that can justify those beliefs. To me, it looks like you have those unjustified beliefs, and then you're adding this additional unjustified belief that the Christian worldview is true, and you don't have justification for any of them, as far as I can see. Let's see. How does Matthew know that God is omniscient? This is a question that's worth asking, right? Because if he can't know anything without being omniscient, Matthew is not omniscient, so he can't know that God is omniscient. Because it just follows from his system that if you have to be omniscient to know anything, that you can't know something without being omniscient, he cannot know that God is omniscient. And so it doesn't matter what an omniscient being reveals to him. An omniscient being can reveal things to him all day, and if he doesn't, if he can't know anything without being omniscient, he can't know the things that are being revealed to him. And so, based on his own criteria, then his worldview is self-defeating. He can't know anything in it because he's not omniscient. And so, by his own criteria, that if a worldview is self-defeating, we should reject it. By his own logic, we should reject the presuppositionalist worldview. And I have just a few seconds left. Let me just, he asked, how can we even know that beliefs exist? My answer to that's pretty straightforward. We are acquainted with our own beliefs, and so that is how we know that beliefs exist. And with that, I'll yield the rest of my time.
All right, good stuff, guys. Great opening statement and great rebuttal. Let me bring this screen back up. Good stuff, guys. Appreciate you guys for the opening and the rebuttal. So now we're going to jump into everyone's favorite part of every debate. It's a cross-examination. This will be less formal, more of an open discussion for you guys. Once again, this will be 40 minutes, and the only time I'll jump in is when I feel that the conversation is being crowded because you guys are talking over each other or you guys are throwing insults at each other, and I don't expect that from you guys. So that said, I will give you guys a stage, and you guys got it for 40 minutes.
Cool.
Okay, I'd like
Matthew,
to respond.
Sorry,
What was that?
What issue did you want to bring up?
I'd like to respond to some of the things that you just said. So for the omniscience thing, I'm not saying that I would have to be omniscient. I'm saying that in order for a limited consciousness that's not omniscient to be justified in believing things to be true, it needs revelation from omniscience, the omniscient being who never lies, who doesn't change, who reveals himself.
Why?
So that's the precondition for intelligibility. Why? Because the omniscient being has all the facts about reality in his mind, and the limited being doesn't. And so, like I brought up the issue of beliefs, how can the limited consciousness be justified in believing? I'm using the word believing because I believe that beliefs exist because of the Christian worldview, but how can the limited consciousness be justified in believing in the concept of belief if that beliefs exist, if the consciousness doesn't know, if the consciousness recognizes that the nature of consciousness could be that there's billions of different little consciousnesses that last for a nanosecond and don't last long enough for a belief to occur. So if that's a possibility, and the consciousness doesn't have all the facts about reality, then that consciousness has to conclude, oh, this, because I don't know everything, this fact, this thing could be true about reality. Because I don't know that it's not true, therefore I have to admit that it could be true because I'm not all knowing. But when you
So in
have
my
the one who
model,
has all the facts of reality, yeah,
well, in my model, you would know that. You would be acquainted with the fact that you hold beliefs, so you would know that beliefs exist. So any hypothetical scenario which says that you don't exist long enough to form beliefs is just automatically ruled out on my acquaintance model.
but I don't see how you could come to that conclusion by being like you're putting faith in the concept of acquaintance. You're putting faith in the concept of having a mind that lasts long enough to be acquainted with things and to have beliefs. But that's what you're putting faith in, and I'm challenging that belief. I'm challenging that faith. I'm saying, how can you be justified in believing that beliefs exist
And I'm
if you're not
answering you and
trusting in
saying
omniscience to tell you that?
I'm saying that the justification is the acquaintance with the fact.
But what is the fact?
Well, that beliefs exist.
And so, what is your definition of a belief?
I guess it's a propositional attitude is how I'll be using it in this debate.
Is a belief something that happens in time?
I would believe so, yes.
Okay. So you're assuming that a consciousness lasts long enough to have a belief. That's your
Nope,
assumption. But how can you be justified in that
I'm
assumption?
acquainted with that fact. It's not an assumption.
You put faith in the belief that you're acquainted with that fact, but you can't be justified in the belief that you're acquainted with that fact
Why
without
isn't
revelation
the
from
acquaintance
omniscience.
why isn't the acquaintance with the fact not justification on its own?
Because the acquaintance takes place in time and the belief takes place in time. So you're actually putting a belief in the idea of acquaintance. You're putting belief in the idea of acquaintance justifying your belief. You're always operating in terms of thinking, right? You're always believing things at all times. So you're acquainted with a belief, but when you're acquainted, you think you're acquainted with it, but what you could be acquainted with is something that's not a belief, right? It could be
No,
a multitude of different consciousnesses that don't
no.
last long enough to constitute a belief.
No, acquaintance is a relation, so it obtains only between existing relata. And so, because it only obtains between existing relata, that's the reason why it guarantees the truth of the beliefs that it justifies. So, that's why the foundationalist, like myself, sees it as being such a strong foundation because it's a direct connection with it, right? There's no inferences going on. And so, it actually, you could not think you're acquainted with something that you're not actually acquainted with. Acquaintance, it's a relationship right between your consciousness and the truth maker of your belief.
So the acquaintance happens in time in your consciousness, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So how do you justify the belief in acquaintance if you don't know that there's a consciousness that exists long enough to have an acquaintance?
You would justify both the belief that it happens in time and the belief that the consciousness lasts long enough to form the belief by acquaintance. They're both going to be justified by acquaintance.
But how can you justify it with the thing in question? Acquaintance is the thing in question. So how can you
What
justify
about
the thing by the thing in question?
what about acquaintance is in question?
I'm questioning acquaintance. That there's a
Questioning that it
that
exists.
there's a that yes, that there's consciousness that lasts long enough to have acquaintance, because if there's a bunch of if there's billions of different consciousnesses that are in a giant stream that happen one after another, then and those constitute the acquaintance, the mental sensation, the mental activity. How can you say that I am acquainted with something if it should be we are acquainted with something? How do you know if it's I? How do
Yeah,
you know if it's we?
I think there are two different questions there. So there's the question of how do you know that there is such a relation as acquaintance? And of course, the answer there is that I'm acquainted with the acquaintance relation. So that's how I know that there is such a relation as acquaintance. And then there's the question of how do you know that it's like a singular you and not a whole bunch of different consciousnesses that are sharing this acquaintance?
Yeah.
And the answer there would
Yeah.
be that those would actually be different acquaintances. You would, since acquaintance is just the relation between the relata, so it's between the consciousness and the object that you're acquainted with. And so, if different things are at different times becoming acquainted with it, those are actually distinct acquaintances. But we can know by acquaintance that it's just the single consciousness that's being acquainted with the fact, and so so it actually would be by acquaintance that you know that it's a singular consciousness.
So you're saying, how can you use this a singular pronoun to refer to all of those consciousnesses? Because
Well, I'm not.
because it's so so the so then it's so you're choosing because acquaintance happens in time, right?
Yes.
So how can you say I am acquainted with something if the the I that was acquainted with the thing is no longer the consciousness that's speaking?
Well, I would say it is the same consciousness.
But the consciousness can't. But what if there's a consciousness that doesn't last long enough to be the same consciousness?
Well, I'm saying you would know by acquaintance that there is such a consciousness that lasts that long.
But if the acquaintance takes it requires at a length of time that involves a bunch of different consciousnesses, then how can how, I'm saying the acquaintance itself, the sensation of acquaintance. Are you saying that acquaintance is a mental sensation?
I would say it's more than just a sensation. I would say it's a relation. It's a relation that holds between consciousness and some fact, thought, or property.
Okay. And so that takes a certain amount of time, right? For that to happen.
I would say it takes place in time. Yeah.
Okay. So you can't say that each individual consciousness is acquainted if the acquaintance requires a bunch of different consciousnesses to happen, right?
I haven't said that acquaintance requires a bunch of different consciousnesses. You were the one positing as a hypothetical, maybe there are a whole bunch of different
Right.
consciousnesses, and I'm saying that the existence of the acquaintance relation itself rules that possibility out.
But I'm saying that it without revelation from God to tell us what's the true nature of reality, we're left wondering, is this sensation that happens in time, does that belong to one entity or does it belong to a bunch of different entities? Is it composed of different consciousnesses happening in succession, or is it one consciousness? And I don't know how you can
Well,
say I have this sensation, I have this acquaintance, when you should be saying it could be that you should be saying we.
Well, I did want to ask you a question about that. So, when you say that we get this knowledge through revelation, you would be appealing to Scripture, right?
Um, this the knowledge about justified beliefs. I believe that non-believers who have never read the Bible, I believe they can have justified beliefs because of the knowledge of God that He creates them with, in which that knowledge is a knowledge that justifies their belief in an orderly creation. It justifies their belief in the reliability of their senses, and that they are continuing as the same being over time. I believe that God um, builds into us certain beliefs about reality, and um, these beliefs are justified by the fact that God gave them to us, like,
How
and
how
the
how would
fact
you
that
know
if
that fact?
we, by nature, by the fact that if He didn't, then knowledge wouldn't be possible. It's justified
How
by
do
the
you know
fact
that?
that if there is no
How do you know
relation,
that knowledge is possible?
I don't know it's possible. Because my ultimate authority, the Bible and God, tells me that it's possible.
So you get this knowledge from the Bible, then?
Uh, the knowledge about what?
That what did you say? You said that God gives this knowledge to you so that it justifies your belief in like sensory perception, the existence of yourself, and such.
Yeah, I'm saying that because people are aware of a creator who holds everything together and create an orderly universe, because of that subconscious understanding that they have, that's the level of justification for their beliefs about reality. And I believe that because of Romans chapter 1 actually says that people know God. It says although they knew God,
Who do you think
they
it's talking
didn't
about
acknowledge
there?
him. They didn't acknowledge him as God. I believe it's talking about all people, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and everybody suppressed the truth in unrighteousness.
So has God given all people over to their lust to defile themselves between themselves? Because that is also the same. Because I mean, Romans 1 goes on; it doesn't make any shift in who it's talking about. So the same people who are said to be suppressing the truth in unrighteousness are the same people that God gives over to like a darkened mind and to defile themselves. And we later read that they're engaging in homosexuality and lesbianism. Do you think that everyone engages in homosexuality and lesbianism?
No, those are some things listed, but I do believe that God, the scripture, it's somewhere says that God has consigned all to sin, so that He might have mercy on some. It's something like that. I didn't directly
It's
quote
mercy
it
on all.
correctly. I mean, it can, okay. Um, so God has consigned people to sin. He's handed people over to their wicked ways, and I do believe that that applies to all people.
So, including the
That just because
descriptions
certain
of homosexuality
I,
and lesbianism? Because it
right,
seems to me
that
it's not even
those are
possible.
some things. Those are some things that people have chosen to participate in after being handed over to their depravity. But that's not. I don't believe the passage doesn't say that every single person handed over will practice those things.
I agree. So then I guess my question to you is if that's not a description of everyone, if obviously God doesn't hand everyone over to be a homosexual and to be a lesbian, why, when it says that these people are suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, do you assume that is referring to everyone? Why is that about everyone? But then when it's the same group of people who are described as being given over to defile themselves, all of a sudden, then it's not about everyone. It seems like there's some hermeneutical inconsistency there.
Because beliefs would be impossible to justify without revelation from omniscience.
Well, I was
So
making
I
an
have to assume.
exegetical point.
Okay, I also have to include my epistemology and my interpretation of Scripture. So, um,
But
and
couldn't it be that
I
knowledge is
always
not possible apart from God, and Romans 1 is still describing only a select number of people? I mean, you could be right about your epistemology, and it could just be the case that Romans 1 isn't supporting it.
um I could be wrong about that, about
Okay.
Romans 1 applying to like every single person. I believe it is referring to everyone, because the Bible tells us that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. So I do have reason to believe that um, everyone has suppressed the truth about God, and there's the work of the law written on people's hearts. So people are justified in believing that there's a lawgiver if they have a moral law written on their heart, right? Or you don't think they're
I
justified
mean,
in not having a law?
I don't know that that conclusion follows. It doesn't seem to me that it follows that a person knows the lawgiver just because they know that there is law. And the text doesn't even say that they know that there is a law. It just says that the law is written there in their heart. But it seems to me that a person can fail to form the corresponding belief, and so they actually could fail to know that this law is written on their heart just by ignoring that revelation. So I agree with you that there is a law written on people's heart, but it doesn't seem to me that Scripture ever says that people actually form a belief about that. So it seems to me that when people do suppress the truth about God, they can also suppress that moral law, and then they can lose their belief. So the law is still there, but they just aren't believing it. And so if they don't believe it, then they actually don't have knowledge of the moral law. And so it would seem to me they don't have more knowledge of the moral lawgiver.
Well, I believe that people can have beliefs that they're not consciously aware of, like subconscious beliefs. So people have a conscience that God gave them. They have a sense of morality, and I'm using um, I'm using both scripture and my understanding of reality through the reason that God gave me to come to the conclusion that God creates people with knowledge of Himself, because you have the Bible going on to say that people know things about God through the things that have been made. Um,
Mm-hmm. That would seem to be
I don't
acquired
know how
knowledge and not innate knowledge.
I don't know how a person could possibly look at everything around them in the world and be like, "Oh, this points to an attribute of God," if they can't be sure that they're not experiencing some kind of radical illusion, if they can't be sure that they're actually a consciousness that continues for more than a nanosecond, that continues through time to take in perceptions about reality, if there's no underlying innate knowledge of God justifying their beliefs, ensuring the reliability of their senses and such, how can they look at different parts of the world and say, oh, that tree teaches me about God, or the stars in the sky indicate that God exists? Well, how can they be justified in believing that they're even seeing stars? How can they be justified in believing that their consciousness has existed for 5 minutes? How
Well,
could that possibly tell them about God?
the way I would answer that is that again we would have direct acquaintance with these certain visual, these certain visual facts that we're experiencing. You'd have acquaintance with that, and then you would ask the question, "What is the best explanation for me having these particular experiences?" And then you'd make an inference to the best explanation, which is that you are experiencing a real world of mind-independent, three-dimensional objects, and so that's how you gain a justified belief in the reliability of sense perception, the external world. And so with that, then you have a justified belief. And so then you can make inferences from design and from first causes, contingency, and such, and even the reliability of the Bible, the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And from those sorts of facts, you can then infer the existence of God and even the Christian God. And so that's how you would get there on my model.
Okay, yeah, and I don't see how you can be justified in the belief that um, direct acquaintance can get you to these other beliefs about reality, and that you can. I don't know how you could get outside of your own mind and even be justified in the belief that other minds exist. And like, how can
By
you
inference.
justify the belief that? But you could be wrong about that. So you're putting faith in your own mind. You're putting
Well,
faith
knowledge
in your
doesn't
own
require
experience.
certainty, so it would be a justified belief. You're making an inference to the best explanation. You'd be saying that the best explanation of these other bodies that I experience and act the way that they do is that they have minds like my own. So it would be an inference to the best explanation. So yes, it would be possible that you're wrong about. Again, knowledge doesn't require certainty, so it could still be a justified belief, and if true, it would be knowledge.
Yeah, and you're putting faith in that belief that it's the best explanation, but I think it can be argued that there's a lot of other explanations that could be the case that explain
What's a
reality
better,
just as well,
like what?
and then you have to figure out what constitutes better and what is the measurement scale by which you judge which is a better interpretation of reality.
Simplicity, explanatory power, explanatory scope. I mean, there are criteria for what makes an explanation the best.
And those are arbitrary opinions you have
No,
about reality. You think that
no,
those
no, no, no.
things are make it better, but
A simpler
there's
explanation is objectively more likely to be true because there are fewer ways in which it can go wrong. That's just true by definition.
but you're assuming that there are fewer ways that it could go wrong
None of
in the
that's
explanation
entailed
being
by what
simpler.
simplicity means. Simplicity means that you're positing the existence of fewer things. So if you're positing fewer things, or rather, if you're positing more things, then about each one of those things, that's an opportunity for it to go wrong. So a simpler explanation is, by definition, that's the explanation that posits the fewest things, and so it has the fewest possible ways it can go wrong. And so, by definition, it is intrinsically more likely for a simpler explanation to be true.
When you say go wrong, what exactly do you mean by that?
Be false. So if I'm positing that there are seven things versus, like, here's an example. If I leave a stack of money on my dresser, right, and I come back and the window's open and the money's gone, I could posit that one person broke in and stole the money, or I could posit that 100 people broke in and each one stole a single dollar off of the stack, right? Uh, there's fewer ways for that first hypothesis to go wrong. I'm only positing the existence of one thing, but that second hypothesis is 100 things, right? So there are 99 different ways that could go wrong. It could be that like two people broke in, right? It could be that three people broke in, four people. And so each one of those is a possible way for my belief to be false, right? There are 99 possible ways for that belief to be false. And so that's why the explanation that one person broke in and stole the whole stack is intrinsically more likely to be true.
So you're relying on the concept of probability.
For inferential beliefs, correct, yeah.
Okay. But if you can't be justified in believing what's true about the basics of reality, how can you know that probability even exists and that
Well,
anything's more likely than anything else?
I would
If you
say that
don't
you
know what
do
the true
know.
nature of reality is,
I would say that you do by acquaintance.
but only but only at a I mean in according to your view, it seems like only at a very basic rudimentary
Yeah.
level. I don't even believe I don't think you can even justify the idea of acquaintance because of the
Why can't acquaintance
possibility
justify
of
it?
so you're trying to use acquaintance to justify itself.
I'm trying to use acquaintance, the reality of the acquaintance relation, to justify my belief that the acquaintance relation exists. So there's a proposition that's being justified by the acquaintance. So the acquaintance is distinct from the belief. If I was inferring the belief from the belief, it would be circular. But I'm saying that the actual acquaintance, that's what justifies the belief that the acquaintance relation exists. Does that make sense?
I don't know how you can be justified in the belief that acquaintance exists.
Why can't
You
you be
seem to be
justified in
assuming that
that?
it exists
Why can't you be
because
justified in that belief by
bec-
acquaintance?
because you're putting faith in acquaintance to try to justify acquaintance. But if
No, no. The
acquaintance doesn't
acquaintance is
exist,
what's
then you can't.
justifying the belief that there is acquaintance.
But so the acquaintance can't be used in that way because there's no way to know that acquaintance exists
Well,
if you
there's
don't
no
have
way for you to
revelation
maybe
from the
know
all-knowing
it,
being.
but I personally am acquainted with the existence of the acquaintance relation. So, I mean, for me, there's not any problem there. I would agree if somebody doesn't already have acquaintance with the acquaintance relation, then yes, me telling them that I did with it isn't going to be helpful to them. But for me, who does actually have acquaintance with the acquaintance relation, I don't see a problem there.
Even though your acquaintance happens in time and could be not really acquaintance because it's just mental sensations happening in billions of different consciousnesses that happen one after another.
No, that
So
would be ruled
that's not
out in my
acquaintance
view.
happening. So you're arbitrarily ruling that out. You're choosing to believe that
No,
couldn't be the
no,
case when it could be the case.
no, it couldn't be the case because I am acquainted with the acquaintance relation. Any hypothesis which posits that the acquaintance relation can't obtain due to whatever factors is just ruled out by the fact that I'm acquainted with the fact that acquaintance exists.
But even the sentence "I'm acquainted" can't be justified because the I, you don't know that the I is acquainted with the rest of the conscious experience in which the acquaintance happens, or that
Well, I gave 4
there's a
arguments in my
consciousness that
opening for why I can.
I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing how a singular pronoun can be attached to what a bunch of different consciousnesses are doing.
Well, it can't be, but I'm not saying that there's a bunch of different consciousnesses there. I'm saying that's ruled out by acquaintance with basically with yourself.
But I'm saying that can't be ruled out by acquaintance because acquaintance could be a bunch of different consciousnesses, and it
Nope.
doesn't actually exist because it's just a bunch of different mental sensations that look like acquaintance.
That would not be a description of acquaintance. So I defined acquaintance as a relation which obtains between a mind or a consciousness and some thought factor property. If you're saying that there's some relation that can obtain between a bunch of different consciousnesses and a thought factor property, that's no longer the acquaintance relation that you're describing there. So the fact that I am acquainted with things rules that out as a possibility.
So when you say I am acquainted, what is the I?
I myself, I mean, I don't. There's a saying that says trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. I don't know if I can really give you a definition of myself.
So you're saying I am acquainted, and so like as I've brought up before, the acquaintance happens between. You're saying it happens between a thought or object and a mind. You say it's a
Right,
relationship,
right.
and that relationship occurs in time, correct?
Yes.
And so I'm just wondering how you can be justified in believing that it occurs in time if every nanosecond in which it happens could be just consciousness belonging to a different entity. And I don't know how
It couldn't.
that
What I
but it
think in
could.
this thought
Like how
experiment
do you
that
know
you're
it
running,
couldn't?
by acquaintance.
But you're using acquaintance to. That's the thing in question. You can't say by acquaintance because acquaintance is the very thing in question. It's the very thing I'm breaking
Um,
down.
the thing that you were questioning was whether or rather, whether you as a singular entity could be acquainted with something as opposed to, or was it over time? You were saying, sorry, no, you were saying that you were questioning whether you could be acquainted with something over time, right?
Um, yeah, or whether you can apply the singular pronoun I to the sentence like am acquainted.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I am
And so
acquainted with this. I don't.
right. You weren't you. It didn't seem to me that you were questioning the acquaintance relation as such. It didn't seem like that's what you were questioning. It seems like you were questioning, can you be acquainted in certain circumstances? And so I was just saying, yes, by virtue of the fact that I am acquainted with certain things, that is how I know that these hypotheticals that you're raising I know that's how I know that those are impossible, basically. But yeah, those it didn't seem to me that what you were questioning was acquaintance, so that's why I answered that way.
So I'm just trying to figure out how um, a consciousness that says I can can how you can be sure that there's a consciousness that can last long enough to say I am acquainted. Like how can you be sure that there's a consciousness that lasts long enough for that to occur?
By acquaintance with
Just
your own consciousness.
just because you might experience that, or you might interpret experience as that happening, doesn't mean that's the case. You're
It would be
interpreting
actually.
experience in a certain way.
I
You're choosing to interpret you're
so
choosing
I
to
don't think
interpret
any.
experience as
Sorry, go ahead.
um how I just don't understand how there can be a consciousness that lasts long enough to be able to claim the I am acquainted. How do we know
Yeah,
that there's a consciousness that lasts long enough without revelation from God? How do we know that there's a consciousness that lasts long enough to be able to say that with justification when there could be smaller consciousnesses that composed what was thought to be an acquaintance occurrence, but we don't know what it is without revelation from God.
yeah. I'll try to briefly answer, and we may want to move on from this topic because we've been on it for almost like 30 minutes now. But yeah, but I mean, basically, it's just the answer is that acquaintance. That's where it starts. So consciousness without acquaintance is basically blind. I mean, if you're conscious and you're not conscious of anything, it seems to me that you're not conscious. So consciousness is consciousness of something, or it's awareness of something. That is the acquaintance relation. So it's just whatever that unmediated relation is that obtains between your mind and whatever it is, whether that's that you exist, whether it's some experience, whatever that is. There's no interpretation going on. There's just a direct connection there. That's what I'm positing as acquaintance. And it's for that reason I would say that these scenarios that you don't exist long enough, whatever, for acquaintance to happen. That's how we know that they are false. It's precisely because we are acquainted with things. Even if we're acquainted with the question, how do we know that that acquaintance lasts long enough for us to, or rather, that there is enough time for us to be acquainted with something? The fact that we are acquainted, that's where it begins. And so then any hypothesis that comes across and says that for whatever reason the acquaintance relation can obtain, it's just ruled out because we already know that we are acquainted with things. Like that just is what it means to be conscious to me, is that you are acquainted with something. I don't even know what it would mean to say that a person is conscious, but they're not conscious of anything, or basically that they have no acquaintances. Does that make sense?
I'd say that the consciousness would have something in it. It would just have the very tiny sensation that would that looks like it's composing an acquaintance occurrence. So whatever composes acquaintance, whatever happens in the mind when acquaintance occurs in this thought experiment, I'm saying, what if there's the possibility of um, whatever that sensation is being broken down into tiny parts, and I don't know how you could take a consciousness and say I am acquainted if that consciousness if each consciousness doesn't even last long enough to say the word I, or even be long enough for an occurrence to happen. So, like, if an acquaintance
So,
occurrence is like a brick, if we split the brick into little slivers, each sliver would represent a consciousness, and I'm wondering how a sliver of consciousness that's having a mental sensation that composes that acquaintance, how can we say, if that's the true nature of reality, if that's the only type of consciousness that exists, how can we say I'm acquainted?
Okay, because acquaintance is a simple relation, so it's not something that's composite. So I don't think a brick is like a very good analogy here, because a brick is the sort of thing that can be divided up or broken into smaller parts. But in the case of acquaintance, that's not how it can be. It's a simple thing, so you can't be divided into further parts. If you tried to break an acquaintance, you wouldn't like be left with parts of an acquaintance. You just wouldn't have anything. To not be acquainted, or to not be acquainted with something, is to just not be acquainted at all. Or I should say, to be acquainted with nothing is to not be acquainted at all. So the acquaintance relation isn't the sort of thing that can be divided.
And the reason I'm dividing it is because it happens in time. So time can be divided. So that's why I'm dividing it up. So it's happening in time. So time is takes seconds or however long. It's a measurable thing. So because it's measurable, I can break it down, and in each little sliver of time, there's a mental sensation happening in a consciousness in this thought experiment.
I'm not seeing the point with that.
I'm saying if it's possible that that's the only type of consciousness that exists, that only exists for that long, not long enough for an actual acquaintance to happen in each individual consciousness, then I don't know how one could say I'm acquainted.
Well, you couldn't, but the fact that we are acquainted with things, or at least I'm acquainted with things, rules out that scenario that you're proposing. Like, that cannot be true because
But
I'm
but
acquainted
you're
with
just
things. So any hypothesis which comes along and says, "Well, what if you can't be acquainted with things?" We just know that that's false from the get-go.
well, you're assuming that acquaintance exists when you say that. But that's the very thing I'm
With
challenging. So
acquaintance,
it seems to be begging the question,
how is it begging the question?
because I'm challenging acquaintance, uh, and I'm challenging the concept of acquaintance, and you're saying, well, that couldn't be true because of acquaintance. So that
Right.
does it seems to be circular reasoning.
Well, I
It
mean, I
seems
would
to be
say that a lot
fallacious
of the
circular reasoning.
charges I would say a lot of the objections that you're making are based on misunderstandings of acquaintance theory, right? So I would say that's why I keep responding to acquaintance, or trying to clarify the nature of acquaintance, because in the nature of the case, just given what acquaintance is, a lot of these objections simply don't apply to it. If your question is, how do you know that there's an acquaintance relation? Again, that's going to be by acquaintance with it. If you think that's circular, as I explained before, I'm saying it's the acquaintance itself that is justifying the proposition that I believe that there is an acquaintance relation. So it's not circular because I'm not inferring the proposition that acquaintance exists from the proposition that acquaintance exists. Rather, it's my acquaintance with the fact that acquaintance exists. That's what's first, and that's what's justifying my belief that there is an acquaintance relation. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, I just don't know how you can have acquaintance with the fact that acquaintance exists if you can come up with a thought experiment in which acquaintance couldn't exist, and that could be the nature of
Right.
reality it without if you don't have revelation from an all-knowing being to tell you what's true about reality, because your limited mind doesn't know everything.
I just don't think it follows that because you don't know everything, that therefore you don't know anything. I mean, if my acquaintance model works, then it's clear that we can know things without knowing everything. So I guess that's just not a concern for me.
Yeah, I and yes, so that's why I believe in innate knowledge of God concerning. That's why I believe that we have this subconscious belief in God, and have perhaps even just specific beliefs that He builds into us so that we can have knowledge, that we can justify our beliefs about reality. Because I just don't see any other way to justify beliefs.
David, you want to respond to that, and then we'll conclude the cross examination.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say I think I have provided another way, and in fact, it's not even clear to me how a person could have revelation from God, or rather know that there's revelation from God without acquaintance. If you aren't acquainted with that revelation, then you need another way of knowing that this revelation exists. And I don't think that Matthew, or indeed any other presuppositionalist, has ever provided a way of knowing that this revelation exists that doesn't ultimately bottom out with depending on acquaintance theory.
All right, all right. All right, that said, that concludes the cross-examination. Thank you, guys. Great conversation. And so now we're going to jump into our closing remarks, which are 5 minutes. And Matt, I will start your time when you begin to speak.
Okay. I have some scripture I wanted to read that's pertinent to the conversation. In the book of Acts, we have Paul talking about everyone, including pagans, that in him, in God, we live and move and have our being. So that's something that tells me that it indicates to me that God is very much involved in our reasoning process. And Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." So what is the beginning of justified true belief? The fear of the Lord. So what do we start with to justify our beliefs? Fearing God. Of course, pagan people don't fear the Lord as much as they should, but I think because of their God-given conscience, they do have a sense of being accountable to God, and there is a sense of fear of God that does restrain their evil to some extent. They know deep down that they're going to be held accountable. That's why they feel guilt when they do evil things. And we have Proverbs 28:26 says that whoever trusts in his own mind is a fool. So I have to take that from the Bible and come to the conclusion that I can't start with my own reasoning. I can't trust in my own mind. My own mind is fallible. It's depraved. It doesn't know everything. So I can't trust in my own mind. I need to trust in revelation from God, which he supplies innately and through Scripture. Proverbs 3:5-6, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him and he will make straight your paths. So it says, don't lean on your own understanding. And then in all your ways acknowledge him. So in my apologetic process, I have to acknowledge him in all my ways. I can't start from a place of trying to reason to him. I can't start with my own mind and not acknowledge him at any point. I have to acknowledge him at all points throughout the entire reasoning process. And I have to acknowledge that if he didn't exist and if he didn't reveal to me what's true about reality, leaning on my own understanding would be futile. And I couldn't get anywhere. I couldn't be justified in believing that beliefs exist or that acquaintance exists. And so that I'm going to seek to, in all my ways, from the very beginning of my apologetic process, I'm going to acknowledge God. And another thing about precept is that because of people's knowledge of God, I'm not trying to prove to them that God exists as much as I am trying to show them that their suppression of the truth and that their false worldview leads to absurdity and leads to inconsistencies and cannot be trusted. It's not a trustworthy source of information. So I'm not trying to make the unbeliever the judge. I'm trying to show them what Scripture says, that they know that God exists, but that they've been suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. So that's what I got.
All right. Thank you, Matt. All right, David, you're up for your 5 minute closing. I will start your time once you begin to speak. I think you're muted, David.
Does that help?
Yeah, that definitely helps, David. That definitely helps.
All right. Well, to conclude, let me just first thank you, Marlon, for hosting the conversation. Thank you, Matthew, for participating. You've been a good interlocutor. I have, appreciated the challenges that you've brought forth to my theory of justification. Ultimately, I think a lot of them misunderstood it, and again, part of that could be on me, just for having a limited amount of time to explain it. But nevertheless, I do appreciate the interaction, and I appreciate your patience and charitability and all of that. We've been debating whether or not one needs to have innate knowledge of God in order to know anything else. And I have been defending a version of acquaintance foundationalism, which I believe yields epistemic certainty with regard to a great many beliefs. Moreover, these beliefs do not depend upon prior knowledge of God, innate or otherwise. We haven't really heard any real objections to acquaintance theory, nor has it been shown to be inadequate. Moreover, I believe that Matthew has utterly failed to provide anything approaching a coherent account of innate knowledge, let alone how it might be justified. Matthew has constantly appealed to the Bible, but he has provided no justification for this belief, and indeed his very system of thought seems to entail that he cannot do this. By contrast, the evidentialist model allows a person to have full confidence and full justification in the truth of the Bible. Matthew has claimed that finite consciousness cannot know anything for certain because there could always be something which will show that everything you presently believe is not actually true. But why should I accept that something as yet unknown could potentially defeat something I know with certainty? Matthew given any defense of that claim, and that seems really crucial to his whole apologetic, is that if you don't know everything, then there could always be something that defeats everything that you think you know. But I've never seen a defense of that claim in this debate or indeed anywhere else. I do appreciate his honesty on Romans 1, saying that he could be wrong, that applies to everyone. And again, I think I could also be wrong that it doesn't. It's a passage I could do more study on myself. But I mean, because of the reasons I gave, there do seem to be some reasons for thinking that Romans 1 is not describing everyone, because again, not everyone has been given over to, an unclean mind and such. And so those are the same people who are said to be suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. It seems to me to be a bit of a stretch to then say, well, that's describing everyone. Regarding a lot of what we discussed, which is, whether you can divide up consciousness and acquaintances and such, I just refer people back to my opening statement and the 4 arguments I gave against that sort of objection to the existence of oneself. So for those who are seeking a more solid foundation for the faith and aren't content to simply assume the truth of their faith, I would strongly urge you to leave presuppositional apologetics. It might be difficult to embrace the fact that our religious beliefs can't be held with certainty, but at least the evidentialist model of justification, which I am proposing, does secure justification for those beliefs. Thus, this gives evidentialism a leg up over methods such as presuppositionalism, which simply beg the question. Thank you.
All right, guys. Good stuff. Appreciate you guys once again for this very enlightening discussion. All right, so now we're going to transition to some Q&A from the audience, and we do have some questions here. I have a super chat here from Mr. MJ Jackson. Thank you for your support, MJ. Appreciate you, buddy. All right, question for both. Is it possible for humans to exchange the truth about the general revelation for a lie? If not, then how do you deal with Romans chapter 1, verse 25?
You want me to take that one first?
Yeah, go ahead, David. You got it.
Yeah, I would say it's absolutely possible for humans to exchange the truth.
Hey, David, hold on one second. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I forgot to lay down the rules. So both of you guys will get 1 minute each to respond. No interrupting. So, yeah, David, sorry. Go ahead, man. Go ahead. You got it.
You're good. My answer is yes. It is possible to exchange the truth of God for a lie.
Matthew?
Yes, it is definitely possible for people to exchange the truth about God for a lie, as Romans says. So another fact about Romans 1, I think that points to, that is evidence that it's talking about everyone, is verse 18 that says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. So the opening paragraph refers to all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. So it's talking about, seems to be indicating that it's talking about all men, because it's people of all different kinds of sins, not just certain sins.
Gotta love
All
it when
right.
a Calvinist finally says the all means all.
Well, I don't think that the all always means all in Scripture in every place.
That was my point.
You guys are a
Yep.
trip. All right, man. We're gonna move on. We got another question here from Jeremiah Nortier. What's up, buddy? Hey, Jeremiah, you can't be posting the same question like 8 times, man. I got the first one, buddy. So he posted like 8, 9 times, thinking I'm gonna answer 2 times. But I got it now. I got it. All right, question for David. For David. In your opinion, is it possible for classical Arminian to consistently hold to presuppositional methodology, Van Til, Greg Bonson kind? They seem incompatible to me. What you think, David?
Yeah, yeah, it's been one of the selling points of presuppositionalism that it's the only method that's consistent with Calvinism, and that's always seemed strange to me. I have plenty of Arminian friends who hold to Van Tillian sort of presuppositionalism, and I think that they're wrong for the reasons I've presented in this debate. But I don't see any conflict between that and their Arminianism. I don't see any conflict between the two. So yeah, in principle, I don't see why you couldn't be both an Arminian and a presuppositionalist. But again, I just don't think you should be a presuppositionalist for other reasons.
All right, Matthew.
Um, I wouldn't say consistently. I think there'd be some inconsistency because presuppositionalism is about believing the Christian worldview, and I would say that Arminianism is not part of the Christian worldview. It's not a Christian, it's not, I mean, there are definitely Arminians who are Christians, but I don't think it's a thoroughly Christian view of the world. Um, so, yeah.
All right. And here's the next question from Mr. Chuck. Chuck, thank you, Chuck. Appreciate your question. For both, in all humility, what good books can I read on this topic of innate knowledge and its possible relation to the Christian faith?
Do you want
David?
me to take it first?
Yep.
Yeah. You know what? If you're looking to get into this debate, a really good introductory book is called Debating Christian Religious Epistemology, 5 Views on the Knowledge of God. It's very up to date, but it's written accessibly. It's written for people who just want to, get their feet wet in the debate. It's 5 different positions on this issue. There's an essay defending the position that I've laid out in tonight's debate. There's a presuppositionalist who defends presuppositionalism, as well as 3 other views, and they all get to interact and write responses to each other. And so it's a really great place, I think, to just look into this debate if you're just getting started.
All right, Matt.
I would say it's a big book called Van Til's Apologetic Readings and Analysis by Greg Bonson, and there it is. And yeah, that's a good place to start. I think Gordon Clark has some good thoughts in his book Reason and Revelation as well.
All right, all right. All right, here's another question for both of you, or for Matt. Sorry, this is from Matt. What if I believe that I am wrong about everything I know? It seems like no matter how things turn out, I happen to know at least one fact without revelation.
And I'm wondering what that one fact would be. um, I'd say, well, you're using. Yeah, I'd have to know what the fact is that you believe you can know, but knowledge is justified true belief, and I don't think it can be demonstrated without revelation from God that beliefs even exist. So you can't know anything if you don't have revelation from omniscience, because you're limited, finite mind could always be wrong. There could always be something outside of your mind or that your mind doesn't know about that could render false everything you think is true. No matter how much you think you're right, no matter how many acquaintances you have, no matter how justified you feel, there's a whole lot of other options that could be the nature of reality, and people tend to choose one of them and believe in it, but without justification, and that's a problem.
All right, David.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what he's getting at, but I think what he might be getting at here is that it's a bit of like a transcendental argument against presuppositionalism. So presuppositionalism kind of pivots on the point that a person can, by being asked questions and such, can actually come to know that unless they presuppose Christianity or revelation from God or something, or even just that if they're finite, that they can't know anything autonomously. Uh, it seems like that is a proposition that the positionalist thinks that the unbeliever can come to know. And so then there is something that they can know without revelation. I'm not sure if that's the point that he's making, but if it is, then I do think that's an interesting point and one that's worth developing against the presuppositionalist.
All right. We have another question here. Thank you for the super chat. Appreciate you. What does the presupper think about Gideon cases with regard to JTB?
I haven't read that whole thing from Gettier, but I do believe there are responses to that, and I don't believe that actually refutes an understanding of justified true belief. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I haven't looked as deeply into that problem as I probably should have, but yeah.
All right, David.
Yeah. So what they're getting at here is the Gettier problem is this objection to the idea that knowledge is a justified true belief. It's based on examples where it seems like justified true belief, but that you don't have knowledge. So yeah, I probably don't have time to give my full answer to that, but basically, I think that the problem can be solved if we insist that the premises that justify your inferential beliefs have to be true. And for people who are, interested in looking into that more, look up Tim McGrew's paper, The Collapse of the Gettier Problem, where he sort of develops that line of reasoning and shows how a justified true belief gets around that problem.
All right. And we have another super chat. This question's for you again, Matt. You said that you can't trust your own mind. So why should we trust anything you say if you can't even trust yourself?
Because I have revelation from the omniscient one who has indwelt me with his spirit and given me his scripture and given me innate knowledge of himself. If I didn't have that, I would be a mind basically interpreting reality on its own, choosing different beliefs about reality, but because my mind doesn't have every fact of reality in it, I could never be sure or even be justified in believing that my beliefs are actually true. And therefore, I need revelation from somebody who never lies, who does have all the facts of reality in his mind, and who tells me what the facts of reality are. And so that's why you can believe the words that I'm speaking tonight.
All right.
I think that the question misrepresents him a little bit because I don't think you actually said that you can't trust your own mind. I think his point was that he couldn't trust it if he didn't have revelation from God. But since he has revelation from God, then he can trust his own mind. If I understood him correctly, that was his point, and I think that the question seems to miss that fact.
All right. And here's another super chat. And this is probably for you guys. Thank you, Mike. MJ, thank you. Appreciate you, buddy. All right, question again. Since we have agreed that people can exchange the truth, can it also be true that some are not suppressing if they have if they have made the exchange. Matt?
So well, because God's innate knowledge that He gives people, they can understand reality. They can be justified in their beliefs of what they perceive in the world, and they learn about God's attributes in the world because of that. As Scripture indicates, we know about God through the things that God has made, and so the Bible says that the heavens declare the glory of God. Um, Creation speaks to us of God, and so people are receiving that, and they're continuing to suppress it. They don't want to acknowledge God. They don't want to worship Him, so they worship the creature instead of the Creator.
All right, David?
If I'm understanding the point he's making, then I think he's asking if someone could not be suppressing the truth if they've already exchanged the truth. That's an interesting reading of Romans 1. It's one I'd have to look into more. There do seem to be some indications in Romans 1 that would suggest that, yeah, the people were suppressing the truth, and so eventually God gave them over to the point that now they don't know that God exists, and that this isn't something they're suppressing any longer. Their heart's just been darkened. That's an interesting interpretation of Romans 1, not one I completely accept, like I said, one that I think is worth exploring.
All right. And here is a question here. Well, let me grab this one. I think this is the one he really was hoping to get you guys to respond to. So I'll ask this one. This is coming from Planticus Bulldog. Thank you for the question. Ask Matthew what it means to have innate knowledge of revelation.
That means that God creates people with justified true belief, that people have beliefs about reality that God creates them with. And these beliefs are, um, from what I can tell, they seem to be mostly subconscious, and people are not aware of them. But I don't believe that you have to be aware of every belief that you have in order for those beliefs to justify other beliefs. And those beliefs that God gives people are justified by the fact that God gave them those beliefs. There's justification as having a good reason to believe something. The fact that God gave you that belief is the greatest reason I could possibly think of to hold that belief. That God is the one who justifies those beliefs. Those beliefs are also justified by the understanding of that you couldn't know anything if those beliefs didn't exist. If those beliefs were not justified, if God has not revealed to us the true nature of reality, then justification for any belief is impossible. So in order to be consistent, if you believe in justified true belief, you at the same time have to believe in revelation from omniscience to limited consciousness so that limited consciousness can know it's true.
All right, David?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many points I want to go on what Matthew said there. Suffice to say, I'm an internalist, so I do think that there is an awareness requirement on justification. So it seems to me beyond impossible to say that you could have a belief that you're not aware of, but that is nonetheless capable of justifying other beliefs. And then like saying that God gave you the belief is reason enough to believe it. I mean, the obvious question there is how would you know that God gave it to you, right? So there seem to be all sorts of problems with that answer, but I won't develop them all here.
All right. And here's a question for you, David. Coming from Merrick Kaiser. What's up, buddy? How you doing? All right. How would your view on this topic affect doing street evangelism? How would it interact with such conversations? Shout out to Matt for his faithfulness in this.
Oh boy, he's not biased at all. Yeah, I mean, how would they affect doing street evangelism? I mean, it wouldn't necessarily affect it at all, right? If you're just giving the gospel to people without giving a defense of it, then I mean, I presume that Matthew and I would preach the same gospel to people. So it wouldn't necessarily have an effect on it. It would only change things up if you were encountering objections to it. And obviously, the way that it would affect that is obviously, in my view, we would be presenting evidences and arguments for people. And instead, Matthew would be telling people that they don't know anything or that they can't justify beliefs unless they come over to his worldview. So the dialectic would become very substantially different if we actually were trying to convince the person that they should believe. But in terms of just giving the gospel out, we're both taking two different paths to get to that same place. So if we're just presenting that to them, then I don't think that the methodology would affect our gospel presentation necessarily.
All right, Matt.
Yes, in the way that we did apologetics, we would differ greatly. And I'm, as a presuppositionalist, I don't want to take the evidential approach of presenting evidence to unbelievers or trying to use certain philosophical arguments seeking to um, uh, kind of establish a middle ground with the unbeliever epistemologically. I want to challenge like every claim that they make and show them that God is the judge. They're not judging whether God exists. They know that God exists. They're accountable to him. They have the work of the law written on their heart, and that they're suppressing the truth, and I want to show them what their suppression of the truth leads to. And so I do an internal critique of their worldview and show them how they can't justify their beliefs. And I explain to them how faith in omniscience in the Christian worldview is a path to justifying beliefs and being consistent in your whole belief system. So that's the approach I take. I want to acknowledge God in all of my ways in every part of my apologetic process and not seek to go with the unbeliever on this journey of reasoning to God, in which we start from the presupposition that the human mind can reach God without God, that the human mind can justify its own beliefs when it's limited and finite and doesn't know everything. So, yeah.
All right. This is a pretty funny super chat here. David, how do you stay so skinny while eating Calvinist and precepts for dinner? Well, I tell you, folks is a handful. Then he does it as a super chat, so he know that I'm obligated. There's a obligation. Me being a Calvinist, I'm forced to post this. But I thank you for the support, man. Ain't nothing wrong with having a little chuckle, a little laugh here. Thank you so much for your support. Appreciate you. All right, so this is not necessarily phrased into a question, but I just pulled it because I think it's an important verse to sort of interact with this conversation. It says, the fear of the Lord is the foundation of wisdom. Knowledge of the one Holy One results in good judgment. Wisdom will multiply your disdain days and add years to your life. How would you guys interact with that from you guys' particular apologetic methodology? What do you guys say? David, if you want to give it a go first.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, this verse it comes up quite a bit in this. I would say it's probably the one that precepts go to the most to justify their belief. I take a bit of an interesting view on the interpretation of this verse. So when we are discussing our apologetic methodology, right? When we're looking at this verse and it says the fear of the Lord is the word there is the, here it says foundation of wisdom, right? We've got verses that say it's knowledge. And it seems to me that presuppositionalists need this word to be read as like origin. This is the origin of knowledge. And that is a possible meaning of the Hebrew word here. I'm going to try to pronounce it. I think it's Reshith is, I think, how the word translated is pronounced here. And origin's a possible meaning for it, but it also can mean like chief, best, first fruits. And so the way I actually read this verse is I take those latter interpretations. I think that those fit the context better. And so I think that they're actually saying that the fear of the Lord is the best kind of knowledge, or we could translate it as saying that the fear of the Lord is the peak of knowledge. I think that saying it is the beginning does not actually fit the context as well, and that falls within the linguistic parameters of the word. So I think that that's actually a better reading of verses like that.
All right, Matthew, what are your thoughts?
Like I stated earlier, I do believe the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge and wisdom in how in how like I've explained this entire time, understanding God, that he exists, having a sense of fear of him, a reverence for him, um, guide is literally the beginning of wisdom. So even for an unbeliever, their conscience that God created with them, with the work of the law he wrote on their heart, that gives them a fear of God, so that they know this is right, this is wrong. They have a sense of, I'm going to be judged for this. God is going to judge me for this. I don't want to do this certain thing. Some people have suppressed that so much that they're not aware of that. They're not thinking that. That's not their thought process. But there are definitely some pagan people who have not been regenerated, who have a fear of the Lord because of the knowledge of himself that he gave them, and that is seen in their conscience, which does lead to a form of wisdom in which they don't do really foolish things and really evil things because of that God-given conscience. And yes, that's what I have to say.
All right, cool. Well, that concludes our Q&A, guys. Great job. I appreciate you guys' politeness towards each other, decorum, and the way you guys are able to get along and converse about this subject matter. It's important that we're able to do this as believers. It's important that we can converse, because we do have atheists watching us very closely, and our behavior definitely needs to pattern that of Christ whenever we're discussing these topics. So I thank you guys for coming on A Gospel Truth. Would you guys have any closing words or anything before I close this thing out?
No, just thanks for hosting.
Thanks for having us.
Participating, Matt.
All right, guys.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Cool. All right, guys. Thank you so much once again. And obviously, I'll be reaching out to you guys again for another debate if that opponent fits your liking. So make sure you guys keep the message open, keep that bell on, because when you see my name pop up, you better answer that message. You guys be good. May God bless you guys. You guys take care. All right.
All right.
Okay. See ya.
All right. Good stuff, guys. Excellent debate. Fun. And once again, this subject is always good to talk about, because you're dealing with not only the Christian world, not only the biblical foundation of where we find apologetics, but we're also dealing with a little bit of philosophy, and we're sort of intertwining these aspects together, because the foundation of any knowledge obviously is from Christ, is from God. So even when we're dealing with philosophy, even from a secular position, they have to understand that God is the foundation of all knowledge. So it's very good to have these conversations. It's very good to have the discussions, especially amongst believers, because this is an in-house discussion, and it is always a great thing to be able to see guys get together and discuss these topics. And, I don't know how this topic made you guys feel, let me know what you guys think in the comments section. And after this video, the live stream of this video is over, let me know what you guys think, and ways perhaps the show can improve, way the interlocutors could have did better, things that you've seen that you liked and that you didn't like. Let me know what you think. I do appreciate your feedback and everything on all this debate stuff, the topic and everything. All right. But that said, I do want to make sure that you guys understand to subscribe to The Gospel Truth and hit that notification bell, because like I said, I have a whole bunch of debates coming up here, and I do want to rehash these debates real quick before I get out of here. So make sure that you guys are staying in lock and key what we have going on. I have Anthony Rogers and Warren McGrew coming up, a dynamic initiates debate that's coming up very soon. So make sure you look out for that one. And I have Dr. Leighton Flowers and Pastor Gabriel Hughes. What is the expository understanding of John chapter 6, verse 44? A very highly anticipated debate, which I know will turn out to be a great one. After that, our Unitarian Considered Christians, Kelly Powers, Andrew Griffin. Make sure you are checking that one out. And then lastly, I have a 2-on-2 debate. I have Francis Stewarton, Dan Chapa, William Albridge, and Sam Shimon debating about Mary's virginity. All right. So make sure you guys are in the loop. Do not get out the loop. Stay in the loop. Hit that notification bell, hit that subscription button, and make sure you are supporting the ministry with the like and subscribe at the very least. All right. All right. That said, I'm going to get out of here. May God bless you and may God keep you. Go on.